Afternoon all, a very exciting round yesterday, round 13, the penultimate round of the tournament, and Gelfand at the start of the round was leading by half a point, so could he consolidate his lead over Magnus Carlsen, who had been defeated by Vasily Ivanchuk in round 12. So the drama unfolding in this round. Let's look at the first game to look at. Let's look at Kramnik against Boris Gelfand. So Vladimir Kramnik playing white, kicked off with d4, and we saw knight f6, c4, and now g6. Now instead of knight c3, the most usual move, knight c3, instead we see g3, so a Catalan type position. Boris Gelfand elects for c6. So we have, after bishop g2, d5, a kind of Slav Catalan type position. White now plays e3. He's just supporting that d4 pawn and offering a pawn sacrifice here, which is accepted. D takes c4. There's no rush for white to try and get this pawn back. Vladimir just plays knight e2. So white is just emphasizing this solid structure in the center for this bishop to be biting on granite. Bishop g7, now both sides castle. And now we see knight a3. And there's some trouble for black to try and hold on to this pawn. This diagonal hasn't got the knight in the way, so b5 could be answered perhaps by knight takes b5 here. Bishop e6 could be answered by knight f4. So this seems slightly uncomfortable if black wants to try and hold on to this pawn. Perhaps there's some interesting possibilities for white here. Or after bishop e6, maybe just queen c2 as well. Okay, so black plays knight bd7. Boris Gelfand doesn't mind the pawn being taken back. Okay, so knight takes c4. Knight b6. And now interestingly, knight a5, which exerts pressure on Boris Gelfand's pawn chain, tying down the bishop on c8 for a moment. Queen c7, the bishop is relieved of its duty for protecting b7, and perhaps in the future c5, or soon c5 would be useful, but b4 clamps down on c5. e5 instead now from black. This is taken, queen takes e5, attacking the rook. Now knight d4, knowing that c5 has been ruled out, protecting the rook. A slight weakness of playing this knight d4 here, well, there still isn't a knight on f3, so a thematic plan for black is often undermining white like this. There was a classic game, Reti against Alekhine, where Alekhine played in such a manner, attacking white's pawn chain of the fianchetto position, and also undermining e3 as a side effect. Now we see knight e4, so pressure is being put on this pawn chain. Queen c2, and now rook e8 supporting that knight, which was under fire. So bishop a3, and it looks as though white wants to do something like b5 at the right moment. For the moment c5 seems an adequate reply, and this battery on the diagonal might be significant, giving black the option perhaps of queen for 2 rooks sometimes. But no, the queen actually now goes to e7, pinning this pawn. b5 is ruled out, rook ad1, and now we see this attack h5. It's not just about going for the king, it's about undermining this pawn chain and weakening e3 a little bit. So you can imagine after h4, things like after hg here, knight g3 might be on the cards, with queen e3. Dangerous possibilities could emerge. The e3 point is made more solid here with rook d3. So a bit of prophylaxis, but also it could be useful for doubling and trying to also play for b5 now that the bishop has been protected. b5 is becoming possible here. Boris doesn't mind b5 in this position. He plays knight d5. Okay, so things are really sharpening up. But b5 still, there might be c5 for black. We see rook fd1. And now bishop g4 attacking that rook. Okay, so immediately there's an interesting possibility of f3 here, which I think needs to be made a note of. F3. So why wasn't F3 played? Well, it could be something to do with knight takes E3, but we'll look at that in the second pass, that technical possibility here. So what's going on here? Okay, so rook C1 was played, and now we see bishop takes D4, giving up that impressive fianchetto bishop. There must be a very, very good reason. Usually when giving up bishop for knight, it's usually to do something on the opposite coloured squares of that bishop, and here now the F3 square is a target of the knight G5. So the strategy of giving up dark square bishop for a knight is usually weakening the opponent's colour complex on the opposite colour of the bishop. So that F3 square seems quite ripe here for exploitation. What has Vladimir got in mind to counterattack against this knight F3 to offer counterplay? Queen D3 is played, inviting knight F3 check. So bishop takes F3, bishop takes F3. A lot of players would be quite worried about this bishop here. It only takes a queen to come in and you end up getting mated sometimes. But here B5, and we see queen E6. But white here has always a defensive move, queen F1, like in a kind of Marshall Gambit continuation where white seems to be in trouble. Queen F1 to the rescue on queen H3. So for the moment, Vladimir plows on the queen side. Knight takes B7. We see C takes B5. Now knight D6, trying to collect this pawn with some advantage. Queen H3, the queen comes back to defend. And then the queens come off. Rook E6, offering the B5 pawn. That's taken. So now, pawn situation, white for the first time in the game, is a pawn up. And Vladimir seems to be also threatening tactics like rook takes D5, bishop takes knight C7. With this bishop protecting the rook, this is more significant, this kind of tactic. We see rook B8. Now the knight goes to D6. Knight F6. Does black have enough for the pawn? With this bishop sitting on this light square, it seems pretty dangerous. Can it be evicted? Rook F4, trying to evict the bishop, goes to D5. Less dangerous perhaps. The king now has a flight square E2 at least. But what about the A2 pawn? Well, that's protected. Knight E4. And white, in the meantime, after knight E4, is given the option of taking on F7 here. So what is the idea of Boris Gelfand in playing knight E4? This F7 pawn is taken, and now rook A6. Both of black's rooks are really active here. Active possibilities like check, but here just attacking A3. So we see bishop C1. Now a very, very interesting move in this position is played. Rook E8. Just protecting the knight means now bishop takes F7 is threatened without losing the knight on E4. This F7 knight therefore loose is actually protected more with rook C7. But the A2 pawn drops, and now again, okay, material situation. White is still a pawn up here, and also seems to have very dangerous threats like knight H6 check. He plays knight H6 check. King H8, knight check again. Getting this position again, and now evicting this knight on E4. Or rather swapping off for the knight on F7. Bishop takes F7. Okay, rook takes F7. Taking the bishop instead of the knight. So what is going on here? Black now threatens a mate in 1 with rook D1, ignoring perpetual check options. Doesn't mind a draw here. Check, check. And now, avoiding the mate in 1 threat, king E1, asking the knight perhaps to move away now. The knight goes to C5. If rook takes C5, king takes F7. The knight's now threatening the menacing knight D3. Check. We see check, check, check. Rook h7, threatening mate in 1. Knight d3 check. King g8. Some more checks. Rook b7, threatening the mate in 1 again. This is parried. Check. Now here, protecting the bishop. Okay, what is going on? White wants to maybe play e4. Was that too slow for bishop h6? Why can't black just take the bishop though? He does. He does take the bishop. Rook takes. Okay, we get a rook and pawn ending. Is this dangerous for either side? Well, if white takes here, what is going on? The rook can't go down here because it'd be mate, surely. So king goes to g1 here, trying to evict this rook. Rook e2. Now e4. Okay, this rook's tied down, otherwise it would like to join in for a perpetual check. a5. Rook a7. The a pawn is used as a distraction. If this rook can be taken off that 7th rank, then rook d2 will be possible to secure Boris Gelfand a draw. Rook b1, a3. The pawn is taken, and now we have the perpetual check facility in place. Rook a7, perpetual check. Draw agreed here in this position. White cannot escape the checks. Let's go through this game in a second pass analysis on some technical moments of interest. So let's go past this opening here, and we'll go to move 17. Actually, we'll go to move 17. White has just played rook d3. Now in this position, the engine is suggesting here knight d5 is a good idea, or h4. What was played was knight d5. That seems fair enough. And at the moment, you know, white's only got a small advantage here. Bishop g4. Okay, now what was going on with f3? What's the real crusher here? It seems at move 19, okay, that this rook c1 move, f3, knight ec3 is pretty dangerous in return. So if we take here, for example, knight takes d1, queen takes, we have knight takes e3, reminiscent of that beautiful Alekhine sack against Reti, where there was an e3 disaster after this h5 plan. So here it looks as though this is a total disaster for white. Queen e2, it looks as though with white's pawn chain destroyed there in the centre, it's very vulnerable, and these pieces are all pretty vulnerable here under great pressure. So this was totally avoided. We see in this position just rook c1, very calm move. Okay, it's a technical point. So here we see bishop takes d4. Another alternative, this is very committal, bishop takes d4, giving up that bishop. h4 may be an interesting option instead. So we can just carry on undermining white's pawn chain. Queen c7 or queen d7. And what could black be threatening here? Well, it's just holding up c6. It's very reminiscent to me of Reti Alekhine after this h5 attack, where white's kind of vulnerable pawn chain wise, even though white has an impressive queenside initiative. But this is a very, very committal move that we witnessed. Bishop takes d4, really going for a light square strategy. It's damaging white's light square control, in particular the f3 square. So we see that immediately evidenced with knight g5, going for that f3 square. So queen d3, the knight comes into f3. So immediately there's crude threats being generated just to mate white, but the queen stands guard for queen f1, but white technically was better here. So Vladimir playing all the right moves, it seems, to get an advantage. So here he's better, it seems. Did he miss a major opportunity? So white's slightly better. Pawn up. Now in this position, this is a very interesting position at move 29, and this was asked at the press conference. White has just knocked out the b5 pawn, giving access to the c4 square, and it's in this position a very dangerous move could have been played. In the game we saw rook f4, which is dangerous for f7, but what of rook c4, dc4, because there's ideas to try and maybe get black on the dark squares at some point. But knight e4 was Vladimir's suggestion, and it shouldn't be that bad for black. Let's test this. King g7, bishop b2 check, f6. It's not clear that this is entirely winning for white, and it is opposite coloured bishops. So maybe this isn't so absolutely critical for black. This position. But it is 2 pawns up for white. But rook b4, it's difficult, more difficult with the opposite coloured bishops. There's a lot of opportunities, and perhaps black can immediately try and get a pawn back like this. And white tries to get this pawn or this pawn, and it becomes tricky. So yes, so that's an interesting opportunity there was for rook c4, but rook f4 dangerous as well. We see bishop d5, rook c2. Now knight e4. Okay. Knight e4 at move 31. This move rook c2 is also interesting here. What's happened to white's advantage after rook c2? From an engine point of view, it dropped quite a bit. So what alternative was there? Like rook a4, rook d4. What does rook d4 actually threaten? Rook c7. There's a lot of pressure on the black position, and if taking here, what would be the punishment? Just rook c7. There is pressure, compensation here. Okay, it's interesting to offer a2, but in the game it was protected for a moment. Now taking on f7. So white has still, it seems technically, an advantage. It's starting to get to be looking really promising. Check. I think an interesting moment now at move 37, this f3 move. In this position where white has a seeming advantage, there's an engine move which Kramnik indicated, well, computers are different to humans. Humans will not pick up this move. But one of the engine moves here, which is promising, is g4. What on earth is this g4 doing, you might ask? Let's see. If bishop takes, rook f takes, f7. Now black has rook c8 to try and distract the rooks. If he plays hg4, check, check, check. And we can go here for rook b7. And what is actually the threat in this position? Mate. So let's say king g8. Check. Now taking on g6. Threatening. Bishop b2 check. And if rook a1, rook c6, rook f8, rook b4. And this is very tricky for black indeed. So this g4 move is very interesting. It's undermining the knight here. Black's going to have loose pieces in this kind of continuation. Or even king g1. Loose pieces now. and some problems. And here, if rook a2, this is a very, very long variation. The rook has to be dragged back. Check. And white could be winning the exchange. This is a very long variation, with the idea in this position of playing g4. So g4 seems to have some very interesting implications in this position. In the game we saw f3, and you see white's advantage dropping quite significantly from a technical point of view. Black now plays bishop takes f7. We see rook takes, and it's kind of more drawish now, even though white's got perpetual check at hand. Anything else apart from the so king g8, parrying the mate. So white tries this. From an engine point of view, this isn't really a big deal. This isn't a big deal. This move, knight takes c1, we get this ending here, just a rook each. It's about equal. So there was a key technical moment, it seems, from an engine point of view, for a key improvement in this game. So the key blunder highlighted by our engine friends is in this position at move 37. Instead of the move f3, we have this interesting move g4. So threats of taking it. So if that's if this is taken, then check. Knight takes g4, and this is very, very different scenarios now. Knight f6 is dangerous. King g1 might be dangerous with the idea of knight h6. Very dangerous position here. For example, a5, king g1, bishop g8, knight f6, takes, a4, taking. This diagonal is very dangerous for trying to win the exchange. Check. But is it enough? Is this enough? This position. Still tricky. Opposite colour bishops is still tricky. Okay, an interesting game. Ultimately, it leaves Kramnik just one step closer. If Magnus would draw this round, then Magnus would be a full point. So putting the onus on Magnus Carlsen to do better than draw, though. At least Kramnik did not lose. He's holding his lead with this win. Okay, and while this game had completely finished, Magnus' game was still going on. So let's look at the next game of the round. Grischuk against Aronian. Grischuk played knight f3, and trying to maybe, knowing that Aronian's had a few slip-ups in previous rounds, especially tactically, let's see how aggressively Grischuk plays. So we have now another Catalan type system, offering the c-pawn. This is attempted to be protected for a moment, but now given up if white wants it. Okay, so here, after bishop g7, white did have the opportunity of maybe holding the centre with e4 to avoid any bishop f5, but white actually regained his pawn immediately. So now black is given that opportunity for bishop f5. Can level really be worse in this position after bishop f5, where white hasn't established the two pawns together? We see queen c3 taking on c4, black castling. Black's position looks solid enough for the moment. a5, and looks as though also, of course, there's a 3-2 pawn majority over here. Queen b3, queen d6 gives possibilities of trying to exchange queens, and we'll get dynamic play on the a file if white takes on b4. Knight e5, knight d7, the knight goes back. The queen now uses that b4 square. Knight e3, queen's come off. Okay, does white have dynamism here? Is it really enough on the a file? Bishop e6, d5, seemingly breaking up black's pawns here, removing the nice island of 3 over there. C takes d, knight takes d5, threatening now the e7 pawn, among other things. Black ignores that. Knight c5, just counter-attacking on b3. Grischuk plays rook a3 here. And now Levon gives up the light square bishop. Okay, so rook ac8. Does white have a significant advantage here? Black is immediately threatening. Knight takes b3, it seems. This bishop gets out of the way. e6, attacking the rook. The rook goes to d6. Now a trade of b for a pawn, but this b pawn was doubled. So is white doing better here? And it seems also knight b3 would fall victim to rook b5. We see bishop c1. A neat little trick, bishop c1, offering the bishop for knight takes b3, attacking both rooks, with the knight and the rook over here. Bishop f6, knight takes b3, rook b5. Now knight d2, threatening. What is it actually threatening? Knight d2. Maybe just to bring back the knight to c4. Rook d3, b6. Okay. b6, just getting out of the way of this bishop. e3. Knight c4. Bishop f1. Bishop a3. Rook d1. Okay, now we see rook fe8. What is going on here? What can white threaten? We see rook d7. Bishop goes back to f8. Now white forcibly wins a pawn with bishop takes and then rook takes. Iranian's position still looks fairly solid in its symmetrical pawn structure now. Bishop e7, rook cc8. Does white have anything? Well, actually, they agree a draw now. What are the missed opportunities in this game? Let's have a look with closer analysis. So in the opening, it seems actually that there was an opportunity here. If white wanted to play e4 at some point, let's see, bishop g7 in this position, e4 is interesting to consider, just setting up that center, but it could be vulnerable later. Let's do a quick reference check. Is taking on c4 advisable here statistically? In this position, hasn't happened too many times before. It seems there is a game, just low rated players. e4, there's rook fd1, b3, it's all been played before. Okay, so it's not of great theoretical significance, this position. Let's go to move 14 in particular. So move 14, we see black playing the natural looking knight d7. Okay, just trying to undermine the knight on e5, and it seems white has a small edge. Is there anything better for black here? Maybe queen b4 immediately. Okay, knight d7. Let's carry on. I'm not really sure there were any major blunders in this game for either side. The a3, the b3 pawn vulnerable, of course. Now taking on d5, creating an imbalance. White with the bishop here. What can black do with the knight and bishop here? b3 has to be babysitted, it seems. But now here, yes, it's just black is winning this b2 at some point, any point here. After bishop g5, black can take on b2, but he first protected e7. But if he plays, this is just going to lead to big trouble, surely. As rook takes a5, and this is not so good, it seems. Okay, so he just protects his centre pawn just by moving it forward, attacking the rook, and now he's free to take on b2 if he wanted to, which he did. So at move 23, engines are suggesting this might not have been the best move, taking on b2. It's only a double pawn after all. What about a move like b5 or rook b8? A little bit of a different story. Is this better version in the game? Knight takes b3, the front of the double pawns instead. Knight to d4. It seems black has active pieces. There is this tactic to do with the back row here. No, nothing to do with the back row, pardon me. It's to do with just winning that b7 pawn. Okay, so but here white's still got a minuscule advantage. Okay, so let's go back. So black took on b2, rook a5, and again it was okay, attacking the bishop here. If this was taken, then surely just knight takes b3, and it's just about equal actually. It's no big deal still for both sides. So bishop f6 instead. White retains a small advantage, but it seems he couldn't really do much with it. Now here, knight d2 at move 26. Interesting. Knight c5 is also an idea. Knight d2, major threat. You just rook c2, rook c7. White he's winning b7 at leisure, but okay, rook d3, knight c4, b6 now, moving that out of the way. If white had taken immediately, white didn't take immediately, knight c4. Again, I think black's doing fine. It seems black's doing fine anyway. So in the game after b6 we see e3. Knight c4, bishop f1. Okay, and now white is preparing to win b6 pawn soon, and we have a peaceful draw continuation. Okay, let's go on to the next game of the round. So Peter Zvidler against Vasily Ivanchuk. So this saw Peter Zvidler play the advanced variation of the French defense, e5. So c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3. Now Max Euwer's waiting move, bishop d7, a high class waiting move it's described as by many annotators. Bishop e2 is chosen by white, knight g e7, after castles knight g6. Okay, black might be threatening knight h4 just to get rid of this defensive knight which is holding up white's pawn chain. Now white plays what seems to be quite an unusual looking move, g3. You wouldn't normally volunteer light square weaknesses, but it's keeping the knight out of h4. That could be an important exchange as part of undermining white's pawn chain. C takes d4, c takes d4, and now the pawn chain is undermined with f6 by Vasily Ivanchuk. And it's actually taken, which seems in one respect to give black some potential play on the f file. Bishop g5, queen f7, bishop e3, although white's pretty solid here. h6, we see knight c3, bishop d6. Now we see a nuisance move, knight b5, the bishop goes to b5, but b8, pardon me. Now the idea is revealed. A dangerous pawn sack idea, knight e5. Black hasn't castled yet. Is Peter Zvidler trying to do some nasty tactical trick based on the king in the centre here? This is taken, d takes, knight takes is played. If it's not taken, then maybe f4 and then just knight d4, and it's very comfortable for white, the position here. If it's not taken, so it is taken, and now the king's stranded, it can't castle kingside. So Vasily taking his pawn, is it poisoned? Knight c4. Okay, so an interesting position after knight c4 by Vasily Ivanchuk. This knight is trying to be kicked with b3. It doesn't move. Instead, Vasily attacks bishop on c5. Now we see bishop b4. Okay, if the knight did retreat, then knight d6 check looks very comfortable, gets the dark square bishop, and still the black king can't castle. a5. And now a very, very interesting idea here is associated with this bishop move. Just bishop c3, offering this bishop on b5, but this bishop sits on this diagonal against this rook, and the idea is revealed now. After bishop takes b5, not taking on c4, but instead bishop h5, and black is compelled to play g6 here. And now bishop takes h5, so winning an exchange after g takes. Okay, in this position though, the immediate winning of the exchange like this might not be so hot. Black is quite solid, you know, taking and then rook e1. Black seems to be quite solid here in this position. Instead, a much more dangerous move now. So just taking a rook and not taking this knight here. So he's lost two pieces. Lost the bishop here and lost the knight there for just black's rook. And now calmly Peter Svidler plays rook e1. There's very tense moments here after rook e1. White is now threatening the seemingly crushing queen takes d5 with that king in the centre. And it's at this point, move 23, that this move, which Vasily Ivanchuk played, might be an inaccuracy, and we'll investigate it in detail in the second pass. Vasily played queen f5. There might actually be a better move available here in the form of knight d6 actually, which we'll check out in the second pass. Queen f5 to protect d5 was played instead. So this is an improved version of immediately taking on c4 now. This is taken, so white is the exchange up for how many pawns though? It's 2 pawns at the moment, these are doubled, but the king is still pretty unsafe there on e8 at the moment. Queen d4, attacking b6, that's protected. Bishop e5, getting rid of black's bishop pair, potentially. Black castles now, queenside. Rook ac1, rook d7. And now a4. So trying to lock down black's pawns before they can start to be dangerous with b5, potentially. That's one of the ideas anyway. So queen g4, queen exchange is avoided. h4. Vasily is, again, he's becoming short on time in this game. Queen takes h6, hg, but also he has a certain amount of weaknesses here. Bishop d8, bishop f4, rook e7, so e6 needed to be protected there. Bishop g5. Okay, and here it gets worse for black. The rook can't go back to e8 in this position, it seems, at move 33. Maybe, you know, white's got a big advantage anyway after bishop takes d8. So here we see king d7. White's just clearly better here. White takes back an exchange, so he's 2 exchanges up. It's not enough compensation really for Vasily Ivanchuk. King g2, bishop c5. And now f3, just kicking the queen. And now check, and Vasily at move 37. Unfortunately, he lost on time. A very sharp game. Let's briefly just check some of the more trickier tactical moments of this game in the second pass. Let's skip the opening and go to move 23. I think that's the move of particular interest, where black might have had an interesting improvement here. We saw off the g takes rook e1, and white's advantage, okay, it's there, but I think at move 23 here that there's an interesting alternative, knight d6, which the engine now comes up with. Knight d6. The idea to offer d5 and to play a stunning move, king d7. So offering the rook there like that and protecting e6. Now if this was taken, bishop c6, and now pointing at white's king potentially, we have queen takes b8, queen f3, and this line, which seems pretty incredible stuff. Check, check. This position, white is still a bit better, but it's going to be quite hard maybe to coordinate pieces. Rook c4, and this was all mentioned by Peter Zvidler, this whole line with rook c4, and he said he might have given this a go, but it's much trickier clearly than the game continuation. So in the game continuation after rook e1, so white's major threat is queen takes d5. In the game continuation we saw queen f5, and now white's starting to get a clearer advantage. So queen d4, and I think there was a further slip up soon. After 26, bishop e5. Here casting queenside, a slight slip up. Apparently just bishop d8 and rook c8 might be better. So here rook ac1, white's advantage slightly more. Black has a lot of liabilities, tactical liabilities in this position. So he's dropping h6 here. So even h4 might not be the best, but this is like time trouble symptoms here. In this position after queen e3, possibly bishop d8 might be one of the better moves. Bishop d8 here. If taking here, rook f7, it's just not as bad as the game continuation. Giving up this pawn gives up also g5 square control potentially, so black's position is a little bit looser. Bishop f4, now unveiling, you know, the e6 pawn as a problem. Rook takes e6, major threat. It's protected for a moment, but now white's got that g5 square which he makes use of, so winning h6 is not of trivial importance. And here, you know, white's just two exchanges up really. So an unfortunate game really, because it's another game which Vasily Ivanchuk kind of lost on time really. He defeated himself, clock management, but he had an important technical resource available at one point in the game. Instead of queen f5 to play here knight d6, if that's of particular interest in this game. Okay, so let's go on to the final game of key importance in this round. Okay, Radjabov playing white against Magnus Carlsen. So Magnus Carlsen really gutted from the day before, losing to Vasily Ivanchuk, couldn't even recover and focus his energies on this game. Radjabov starts with d4. Magnus plays knight f6. After c4, e6, we have actually the Nimzo Indian. Queen c2. Now let's move d6. And you might wonder, well, doesn't d6 mean queen a4 might be handy? Queen a4, knight c6, and it's quite a tricky position, actually. It's not so clear cut. Let's actually do a very quick engine check. It's like the Bronstein Dream video we covered. I think white's not really winning a piece. In any case, there's, well, e takes, c takes, knight takes here, in any case the pin, there's no way of winning a piece. So just in case you're wondering, so let's go back. So knight f3 by Rajabov, knight bd7, g3, and now Magnus castles after bishop g2, e5. So black is trying to weaken white on the dark squares, castles, just keeping that central tension. c6, and now rook d1. Okay, it's threatening now. D takes and knight takes e5. Uncomfortable pressure for a moment. It's parried rook e8, just protecting e5, and the bishop potentially can come back all the way to f8 if d takes as well. D takes is chosen. D takes, but after a3 the bishop actually doesn't go back to f8. Magnus exchanges it off on c3, and as I've mentioned recently, exchanging off for a knight is usually a light square strategy. Black wants to kind of potentially put pressure on the light squares here, so like e4 and d5 maybe later. So we see queen takes c3, avoiding double pawns, queen e7, but white is stretching out now on the queen side. b4, another light square of attack though. Knight b6. Black has got an extra piece for a light square campaign here to put pressure on c4. If this ever moves forward, then knight d5 is a pleasant position, surely, for black. Okay, here though, knight a4 might also be handy for black. If bishop b2, which is a natural move, knight a4. So I think Engine's suggestion here, which we'll check in a second pass, is a4. But white here voluntarily gives up, basically, or basically puts this dark square bishop in jeopardy here. He plays actually the move 14, bishop e3. So the move 14, bishop e3 is played here. So a4 might have been slightly better. So knight g4, and the bishop doesn't move now, it just offers itself up. So white plays knight d2. By losing the dark square bishop, white in turn is going to do battle on the light squares with his remaining pieces, knowing that a knight has been eliminated from black's light square campaign. But Magnus doesn't have to take on e3 immediately. In fact, he plays f5, and he's aiming to shut down this bishop on g2, keeping the suspense of taking on e3. Okay, we see h3 asking, like, does it really want to go back now? Because actually there might be some unpleasant things going on, like bishop c5. The knight takes the bishop, queen takes. Okay, so e4. This bishop seems hemmed in by its own pawn, but it is shutting down this g2 bishop. Rook ac1, bishop e6. c4 is still a little bit of a target, potentially useful battery as well. Queen c3, rook ad8, bishop f1. If needed now, e3 to support c4 even further. Magnus plays now c5, so he's locking down against white playing c5. This is taken. Now knight a4, getting the pawn back with a seemingly nice knight on c5, and these pawns are slightly fragmented. So black's a little bit more compact on the queen side, both with knight and bishop each. We see knight b3, exchange of rooks, knight a6, offering the exchange of queens. This is accepted here. Okay, so a quiet position. Can Magnus really win from this position? He really needs a win to try and catch up with Vladimir Kramnik. There's various opportunities though for improving the black pieces here. The infiltration seems a little bit worrisome, but after knight c5, okay, even an invitation to exchange off knights, but then maybe black can use the b file as an infiltration resource. Knight d4, just purchasing the knight strongly in the centre instead seems a reasonable option. And black's pawns are quite fixed against f4, but what about g5? This must be a concern for white soon. So king f6, king f1. For the moment it might be too loosening for Magnus to consider a move like g5. So this is at move 30. So let's just take in this position at move 30. Okay, we see rook d7 and check, king e1, g6 is played here. Okay, this shields against maybe bishop h5 might have been a resource. h4 fixing down black's pawns, so Magnus is pretty fixed on the king side at the moment. h6, rook c8, bishop e6, check, some shuffling, some manoeuvring, knight b5, the rook goes to d7, still holding a7, and it looks as though knight d3 might be useful. That's shielded, knight d4, h5, and the pawns are really fixed now. White's controlling f4 and g5 here. Can Magnus really win this position? It looks pretty tricky to try and win. a6. Okay, so what is Magnus doing with his pieces here? Shuffling, shuffling, offering exchange of rooks. And I think here Magnus in the post-game interview thought this gave him a tiny bit more winning chances with the rooks off here. Does black really have anything? If it's anything, it's like minuscule here. His pawns are fixed on the king side. Can he work on these two pawns and improve his king? We see the king coming to d6, king e5, a5, as though there's a threat continuing now of a4, but it doesn't have to be used. It does weaken the b5 square. We see bishop e6 and now bishop d7 covering that b5 square, and looking at a4 for the bishop, which actually it uses now. So some probing maneuvers for a moment, and white really, if white doesn't do anything, it just sits tight. It's hard to imagine actually Magnus winning this position. A lot of manoeuvring. We're really, it's difficult to see how there's progress made. But now we see this move 64. On move 64, the move a4. Let's just rewind this. This is a critical moment at move 64, and many people believe intuitively, as well as with our engine friends, that this is not such a brilliant move. It looks like a positional mistake because it's leaving a pawn on the same colour as a target for the black bishop. So it does look like a positional mistake, and our engine technology indicates this is a less than optimal move here to play a4. Radjabov maybe not be feeling the most confident in the world. He has taken quite a lot of losses already in this tournament, and okay, it offers a glimmer of hope, this move a4. It also of course weakens b4 as well, but I think the main point, it's a target for this bishop. So this is a key turning point at move 64, it would seem. Okay, so Magnus has got now also the 50 move rule, of course, which indicates that if there's no action, especially with any pawn moves, then 50 move draw rule. If nothing was happening, potentially there's the 50 move draw rule, but now it starts all over again because this pawn move. So Magnus can endlessly maneuver now if needed. He's got to try and win this game. He's got to try and catch up Vladimir Kramnik. Plays king d6, check, king c5, knight d4, bishop e8. So white's tied down here, and he's also got this weakness here. This bishop cannot look at both of these weaknesses. So it's a case of two weaknesses now, d3 and a4. White does have a resource though here, check, and is able to dissolve or try and dissolve one of the pawns. Now this is a really interesting decision here, that white plays c5 check at move 69, and Magnus doesn't play what maybe engines consider a slightly stronger move at a certain depth, Magnus doesn't play b takes c5, I think it would offer black minimal opportunities to win the game. I think there's slightly more practical chances with Magnus's choice, I suspect. King c7. We'll try and do a detailed check on this position here. I think it's quite critical. So I'll put a note to investigate further here after c5. This b takes c5. Magnus's move is instead king c7. So what is happening with king c7 exactly? Well, Magnus is holding on to a potentially passed a pawn, running a pawn. If he had taken here at move 69, let's see, if he had taken knight takes a5, just very briefly, bishop takes a4. Okay, so for the moment black is a pawn up, but it will be very difficult to win this game. Say knight c4 check. There is a very strong practical blockade here to make note of. Knight takes c4, bishop takes c4, and you know, this f7 square is also a big concern for all of these pawns on light squares. This could be very tricky for Magnus to win. It's much more simplified. And look at white's pawns, they're all away from this bishop. So I found personally this, believe it or not, I think here, just here at move 69, is potentially a moment of great historical importance for chess in relation to Magnus being a potential candidate. I'm doing this video the day of the final game. The games are in progress. I don't know the games today in the final round, but I would say this was a fantastic practical decision to keep this a pawn on. Black has to keep this a pawn on, I think, to have real winning chances. He played king c7. I think this is genius. King c7. It's trying to give losing opportunities to white. The other way of doing it, this bishop would not have seen any targets in white's camp. Black's extra pawn would be extremely difficult to convert. Black's pawns would be a target for white's bishop. So this was extremely practical move, king c7. Now we see king d4, even allowing a potential infiltration. King d4, it seems a bit of a menace. The knight goes back. Knight c6 check. Okay. King c3. What can Magnus make of this position? Should it still be completely drawn here? It's only a tiny bit better, I think, technically, for black. Magnus has got to win. And I recall Ralston's book, 7 Deadly Sins of Chess, and he's indicated that one of the 7 deadly sins is wanting a particular game result, even if the position doesn't sort of indicate it. But if one has a tiny edge, I'm not sure it contradicts Ralston's advice, because no game, you could say, was ever won if a draw was agreed. And if you have a small, tiny advantage, even a tiny advantage, there's still a glimmer of hope you can win. And I think in that circumstance, it's okay to want a win. If there's minimal risk of losing, then it shouldn't have too many downsides. And that, I think, was Magnus's approach here. He hasn't got too many losing chances. He can play on and play on. I hope there'll be enough blunders from the opponent to try and get a meaningful advantage and try and convert this into a win. This microscopic advantage that he might have here in this position. We see now c takes b6, king takes, with the pawn protected by the king. Okay, but there's still a target here and potentially a target here. These are the two key targets. And white in this position, okay, it looks a little bit tricky really already here, that white plays knight d2, offering the a pawn. Check. Check. So white has lost that a pawn. White is a pawn down. Was that actually forced? So at move 75, now Magnus has got something to work towards, a little bit more advantage. So why did white have to lose the a pawn in the way he did? Let's just rewind slightly. So c takes b6 was played. This a pawn has been under fire from this bishop here, and we see knight d2. The idea is to just sack that a pawn to try and reach this position. This is what white thought was the practical way of trying to secure a draw here, basically. But it's a slightly better version with black still having that a pawn. So we see knight c4. Okay, is there a repetition on black's a pawn? The king has to protect. Check. King a7. Now it's here at move 77. We see king d4, which doesn't seem still too much risk. Surely white can still attack the a pawn, and the king maybe has an optimistic idea as well to get to these pawns. But we see check fending off the e5 square, and we see king c5 now on move 79. King c5, which again, okay, is not such a big deal at the moment. Knight e5, eyeing that sensitive d3 square though. We see, in fact, now knight c4, and now this move knight c4 is very interesting. Let's just rewind it. I think here is a critical moment again at move 80. Magnus has achieved a technical pawn up, agreed. This bishop still has no targets, they're all on dark squares, whilst this bishop potentially has got targets in black's pawn structure. Is this pawn really of theoretical interest only? This next move, which was played at move 80, knight c4, is, engines believe this is slightly suboptimal here, and there's an idea that Timur was getting tired here of defending a slightly worse position, and what he should have played here, we can say technically, is, for example, the move knight b5 check. That might be okay for white as well. Knight b5 check, or at move 80, king d4. Now this king d4 would keep an eye over d3. And how would black actually make progress? He hasn't got any meaningful targets for this bishop. This would be a way of stubbornly refusing to go down in the position. But what we do see is knight c4, and this gives now Magnus the opportunity to play the dynamic move knight d3 check. And we see the engine evaluation change dramatically after this. Let me just show you now, because I think this is a very long game. I'm not sure a full detailed set and pass is warranted. I'll try and just get back to these very key moments here. Black in this position was minus 4.0. Okay. Now a move like knight b5 I don't think it alters the evaluation that much. If this is taken, king takes, knight d3, we can play f3 here. It's not a disaster. It's not a disaster. And this should be tenable. White can even try and get rid of all the pawns here with g4. The a pawn's not going anywhere. But in the game we see this knight c4, and this is a major opportunity. Look at the evaluation change from slight advantage the informative symbol for clear advantage, in case you don't know, is here. Knight d3 is now a clear advantage, approaching a clear advantage with knight d3 check. So this was another blunder. So what is going on here now? In the game we saw king d4. Well, the problem is bishop takes d3, e takes. What does white play now? If he tries to get this pawn, we have bishop c2, and now the knight's tied down because d2. If takes, we play d2, queening, and with the knight tied down, a4. So black has made progress. And if the king tries to go over here, the knight's overloaded. Surely a4, because we're threatening now a3. The knight cannot handle both of these pawns. So this is a point where now it's really getting bad for white. In reality, there's a glimmer of hope. So bishop takes d3 is mentioned here, but king d4 in the game was played, and that's a very, very clear advantage after king d4. Bishop takes d3 might have been, in fact, a lesser evil. It's really gone now after this move, king d4. The position seems to be even worse. Now Magnus is not interested in taking this pawn on f2. If he did take the pawn on f2, maybe that is still slightly better for white, because the knight has this target here. But this pawn, these pawns are all on light squares, and this might not be as clear cut as the game. In fact, what Magnus played in the game was go for a nasty, nasty pin. He played knight c1, and the idea of this is to get a really horrendous pin against white on this diagonal if the bishop goes to f1. The bishop did go to f1, allowing this horrendous pin. Now if the bishop didn't go to f1, say the bishop goes to d1, well, it's just taken there. Can't go to d1. Pardon me. So bishop f1 runs into this pin, bishop b5. So Magnus has really got not just an academic a pawn, but it's of greater significance now. Black's really threatening a4, a3 potentially. White's in trouble. And here, white gets very desperate. He gives up a piece now. At move 83, he plays knight takes a5, which is given as most annotators as a clear blunder. So let's see, he tried to fight on, he didn't give up a piece. He played king c3 instead. a4, still Magnus has the advantage now. That pawn is really a real dangerous threat. This pin is particularly nasty. And if we unpin, taking, check, f2 drops, surely, and black's better, simply. Or even king b6, just holding up the idea of knight f2. But this should be a meaningful advantage now for black. This sort of position here, and black should be able to convert this. I think this is convertible now, this knight and pawn ending. It may be gone now. Let's just give the exact methods. And an example. If we have this sort of position, can black increase the advantage? Depth 20, knight h2 as a resource now springs up. And what's the threat? Knight f1, for example. Knight f3 here. King e5. And what is black actually threatening? King f6 now threatens surely g5. This could be the winning plan, and then get the king to g4. So I believe this would be the winning plan. g5, we get a very aggressive king coming to g4. So before this final blunder at move 83, we see this giving up the piece. It's pretty miserable by this point in any case, with a4 coming up. So here white just gives in a final blunder, making Magnus's job much easier. This is the path of least resistance, giving up the piece here. There's not too much compensation here for white for the extra piece. So Magnus undoubtedly delighted that he's still in with an opportunity here after bishop g4, because white resigned in this position. So he caught up with Vladimir Kramnik. I must confess I have a slight bias overall for Magnus to win the tournament. I think we've seen on this channel, the King's Crusher channel, so many fantastic Magnus games over the last few months. He does seem to me to be the Mozart of chess, and he's proven to many people you don't need to study tons and tons of opening theory to get results against the strongest grandmasters we have on the planet. You can win like how Capablanca, Giles Rule Capablanca, used to win, and often emphasize that the game of chess should be studied in reverse. You should study the end games first, then the middle game, then the openings, because what is the point, he argued, of getting good positions in the opening and middle games to squander them later? So if you work in reverse, then that's a method of studying chess. Modern chess dictates we learn tons of opening theory, we buy tons of opening DVDs, etc. There's an emphasis on openings because they're concrete knowledge you're grabbing from the start of the game, unavoidable knowledge. End games, as Magnus has demonstrated time and time again, you know, it's really, really great to be a great end game player and a grinder. In this game, yes, it wasn't an example of a magnificent end game technique. He needed to win this game. He really did need to play it on. Thankfully for Magnus, he did have a tiny advantage to nurture and to try and torture white with. There were key moments he made brilliant decisions where he kept exploitable targets and exploitable assets. In particular, keeping his A pawn was a brilliant moment. We can engine check key moments of this game to validate that. I think this last round now is thrilling, and this day with the clocks changing forwards in UK has been on a very dramatic fast forward for me generally, and I really did want to see the games live, but I really felt compelled to check this game out as well. So let's see, out of the opening, white was slightly better. Now this bishop e3 starts to be a bit maybe dubious. A4 might be a little bit better. So we see black getting close to equality. And now after knight d2 and f5, you know, black's gaining space. And it didn't seem, okay, it's a small inaccuracy, but they kind of all add up. So at move 15, we saw knight d2. If we go back, I'm just checking my other notes here. At move 15, knight d2, he's not keeping the bishop here. Bishop c1 as well, as mentioned here. Bishop g5. The engine's not really liking giving up the bishop pair here. Even though positioning, as I've mentioned, it's one less piece which can be used to fight on the light squares, getting rid of this knight. But it's not taking immediately on e3. Only after prompting now. If knight f6, I think I mentioned bishop c5 might be a move. Is that nonsense? Knight a4, it is nonsense actually, pardon me. Knight a4 is always a resource here. So to make bishop c5 more effective, a4 here, then white's keeping that dark square bishop, and that should be okay for white. So here it's snapped off by Magnus and now shuts down this bishop. But he is kind of making these pawns fixed in doing so. There's a downside to this. This bishop's locked in. The engine preferred move is actually to do something else, queen f7 or queen f6. It keeps the pawn structure more fluid. We've got a much more fixed structure here, and with these pawns, you know, you usually want this structure against that, and with this bishop having no exploitable targets on dark squares, as well as restraining all of black's pawns from being liberated. And white kind of gets that type of position later. So even though black's got now a good opening position, black's got some sort of tiny advantage here from the opening. Doesn't mind exchanging off queens here, white. Maybe this was a slight inaccuracy as well, exchanging off queens. especially against a player like Magnus, who loves, who can play on and on in simplified positions. So at move 24, if White had decided to try and keep the queens on, would that have been better? Queen b5 might be an interesting alternative. Does it lose the a3 pawn? No, the rook's on, pardon me. Doesn't lose a3. The rook moves, so attacking a3. Queen e5, keeping black from queen a3. And this should be okay. It's an alternative to the game. So the queens came off. So Magnus had a tiny advantage here. So it's really you know, this pawn structure looks more aggressive than White. It gives black the e5 square to play with, which can be a source of torture for this knight later to probe these two key squares, or a king coming there. But as far as pawn structure liberation like this is all locked down pretty soon in the position. So we get a position here. It's difficult really for White to make progress. It's difficult for black to make progress. Okay. Let's restart the engine here. It just seems to have a breakdown here. Looking for the game or something. Rook c8. So black's nurturing a small advantage and trying to make improvements to his position. Subtle improvements. But okay, White really helped Magnus's cause. So here, the exchange of rooks, I think, was the first thing to Magnus's liking here. So at move 47, more tenacious at move 47, arguably more tenacious, is just to keep the rooks on. Keeping the rooks on will keep all the chances for like checking the black king, for example. And if we play a move like rook a8, the engine recommended move, how can Magnus actually improve his position? If he plays, well, b5 is locked down, we can just take that pawn. We've got knight and bishop on it. There's no tactical compensation. It's nothing, this position. a4 here, White's better. Magnus would be losing that. So rook a8, and it's very difficult to see how Magnus would win. So taking, okay, extinguishes off a major resource, which could have been the source for endless checks. And okay, more simplified. Is Magnus showing that he's the new kind of Capablanca, that this is the kind of position now which maybe Capablanca in old times would have excelled in? Okay, so a tiny concession was made by White, maybe through impatience, of putting a pawn on a light square soon. So knight d4, White seemed to be able to endlessly maneuver here. He can just throw in a check and then back to d4, for example. But no, he throws in the check, and for some reason he didn't play knight d4. I mean, that's the simple one, knight d4. What would be wrong with knight d4 here? Is it terrible? As long as all these pawns are really kept on dark squares away from this bishop, you know, White just has to nanny this pawn and this square and this pawn on the light square. That's the target. But he offered another target, and sometimes you just need two weaknesses to be able to win. One weakness is not enough, but now, you know, there's potentially two weaknesses, this pawn and this square. So black's advantage has gone up slightly. Okay, so it's not as pleasant now. Bishop e8. And you might think, well, why couldn't White have defended this pawn with knight b5 instead of having to play this pawn sack? Okay, let's take this in. It seems either the move bishop c6 or bishop d7 is strong here. Let's go with bishop d7. Is it the case that White, dare I say it, is in a form of zugzwang? If the knight moves, a4 will drop. The pawn has actually put White in zugzwang. we can't do this now. This pawn will drop and it's horrible. There's no compensating check, really. And it's two weaknesses. It's the principle of two weaknesses. If the king moves away from d3, knight d3 now, attacking f2. And if this is snapped off and the king tries to go back to the rescue, d2. d2 here is crushing. King takes c4 and then king b4. We've got an aggressive king now on our hands. Bishop c6 controlling all the squares. King b4. This pawn is dropping, and two passed pawns here. This is terrible for white. This is losing for white. So really, this pawn all of a sudden is forcing white into this combination here to have to sack the pawn. There's no other way. Knight b5 is just hopeless, it seems. I think this is an important note about the game here, that this position here with this target. Why is this target of such importance? There's a Zugzwang implication of it tied up with this d3 square, having to protect d3 as well as a4, shield a4 in this position. So knight b3 was absolutely the best move by white in the circumstances. And now we see in this position, this is absolutely the best practical try for black to keep his a pawn, to keep things going with that a pawn. Otherwise white has no targets, and he's keeping this pawn as a target. So check, and it requires another blunder now. So even after winning this pawn, white's not in any sort of Zugzwang, but he slips up again, coming up with knight c4. And now, you know, some dynamism in this ending is demonstrated with this move knight d3 check. So king d4, knight c1, getting this horrendous pin. So this pin, even in this endgame position, is really, really nasty. And now white capitulates basically with knight takes a5 instead of trying to offer any further resistance. So knight takes f5, a5 basically kept in effect resigning. So that long line we saw before, by the way, if he didn't play, just to recap on the long line before, we could have got this sort of ending where the knight ending is ultimately lost, because the black king comes to the g4 square. We see in this example variation the black king using that g4 square. So it shows that if you have real determination in chess and you really need a result, sometimes it pays to just play on and on and on until the opponent plays enough mistakes and you get your desired result. So maybe it's human nature to want things, and if you're not taking too much risk, why not? Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.